Well, Josh, thanks for inviting me. And sorry I couldn't be there. Life intervened, and so thank the Lord for Zoom. Um, I don't know what regenerative agriculture really is. It's like a fat-free hodgepodge sundae. We really want one. We really, really want it. It's just doesn't exist. Now, could it exist? I would ask my co-panelists, maybe as the first question in the discussion is it possible if you were in charge, could regenerative agriculture be real? But I know it's not real and could never be real on grazing on the federal public lands. So let's just take that off the table. And I will whip out a little PowerPoint here. I started my conservation career during the Ford administration, and I have come to the conclusion that grazing reform on public lands, the only kind of reform that's possible is not better grazing, but it's no grazing. So I'm for equitable abolition of livestock grazing on public land. We'll talk about that. But it has a disproportionate political impact and power on managing the public lands, and it's rather astounding. But so I'm going to talk about the numbers, a little bit on the carbon consequences I want to feature a little bit, and then about the equitable and the livestock grazing on federal public lands, where it's been done before, tips for dealing with permittees and lessees, and reminding us it's just about the money. It's just money. And so an extraordinary amount of the public lands, mainly in the arid West, are dedicated to livestock grazing. And 41% of all the lands in the 48 states is dedicated to pasture and range and production of livestock feed. Of that 41% of the nation, all ownership, nearly a third is federal public lands by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. There's a little bit of grazing going on National Park Service lands and Fish and Wildlife Service lands, Department of Defense. I don't include those in these numbers. The federal public lands, meaning BLM and the Forest Service, produce 1.3% of U.S. feed and forage for cattle and sheep. Only 2% of U.S. farms and ranches graze their livestock on federal public lands for any part of the year. And there is plenty of private farmland exists to absorb the contribution to feeding the nation's cattle and sheep that grazing on federal lands currently provides. Now you notice my preference might be we all eat a little less beef, maybe a lot less beef, and we do a whole bunch of other things. But I'm just saying there is an alternative to grazing livestock on federal public lands. This is from Bloomberg. It's behind a paywall, so I just took it. Bloomberg did an analysis of lands in the United States, and this is one of their slides. And this graphically depicts that 654 million acres is pasture and range. A third of that biggest square you're seeing on the screen is Forest Service and BLM lands. Then there's livestock, feed, and crops, 127 million acres. That includes hay, alfalfa, soybeans, corn. Most corn used to be grown for livestock. Now a lot of it's grown for ethanol. But livestock eat a lot of the commodity crops, etc. And so 41% of the United States is dedicated to the production of forage. So even in the West, that's not much. Even in the 11 contiguous Western states where most of the livestock grazing occurs, it's only 4% for cattle and sheep, respective. 4 and whatever, I can't see my screen right now, sorry. So any slack could be taken up. We don't need to be grazing on federal public lands at all. The amount of, you take the AUMs for the Forest Service and the BLM and you divide it by 12, so you get the animal units that are supported in the course of a year by public lands. Animal unit is normally the amount of forage to keep a cow and a calf alive, or its equivalent. And it's a little bit of this gap here. It's well within the numbers. You know that we have a low here. This data was missing because of the federal shutdowns, so these lines have gaps. But the contribution of federal public lands within this band of the normal highs and lows of the inventories of cattle and sheep in the United States. So all of these numbers with all the citations are in this memorandum. You can get it from my webpage with this link, my hot dash stuff page, or I believe it's on the conference website at all. So you don't have to take any notes. They're all in there. I want to highlight this paper, and I know Bob was there, and this paper that came out very recently is, I think, a landmark paper in several ways. First of all, for those who don't like livestock on public lands, you'll enjoy reading this paper because it enumerates and categorizes and documents and cites the sins of public lands livestock grazing. What I found interesting most about this paper, new to me, was about the carbon consequences, the impact of grazing on public lands versus private lands. I was under the impression when people say, yeah, we could get cows off public lands, and I'm kind of going, well, yeah, that I certainly want to do that, but I don't know if there's a carbon add-on additionality because the cows just go elsewhere, so to speak. But what this paper talks about is the methane emissions from feedlot cattle are huge, 2 to almost 3 times as much as those on rangelands. And a lot of this has to do with, grass-fed beef, which we all we believe is better for us. And of course, feedlots suck. Let's not forget that. But this paper documents, especially in high and exotic grasses, if you're still going to have these cattle, you'd actually rather be growing them in feedlots than on public lands because of the very low quality forage diet that the cows have to eat and then belch massive amounts of methane. So I was quite struck by that in this paper. So we need to end livestock. I use equitable. It's a term of law. I'm a college dropout, not a lawyer. Equitable means fair and agreeable by the parties. Equitable end to livestock grazing. It's been done before. Now, these examples are where there has been legislative permanence. There have been grazing allotments on public lands retired from grazing relying on administrative action. The National Wildlife Federation in particular has been buying out grazing allotments and sometimes trading grazing allotments and things in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. They're relying on the goodwill of the federal government to not ever bring cows or sheep back to these allotments. My concern about that is that's not necessarily permanent. A lot of funders who want to fund grazing permit retirements want that permanence. They don't want to spend the money and then have a new administration come in, such that was, the Grand Canyon Trust is a proud owner of grazing allotments in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument because actually under a Republican administration, libertarian kind of streak, they were on a path to retire those permits, and then the world changed. So I want to focus on legislative permits where you have an act of Congress that says these permits may be retired. The permittee may waive them back to the federal government. It doesn't give any authority to the BLM to say yes or no, or foresters to say yes or no. If the permittee waives it back, all the government knows is, hey, this guy says he don't want the permit anymore, and now we can't graze it under the statute. Now what happens is money has greased the palm of these permittees to waive back their permits. The first one in the modern era was Great Basin National Park, established a few years before 1996. The first superintendent of the park steadfastly refused to fence the campgrounds, which were often overrun with cows. So that got the attention of Senator Harry Reid and the Nature Conservancy and others. And there was a piece of legislation passed that said if these permits are retired, because remember, Great Basin National Park came from a Forest Service special interest area that was redesignated a national park. It's kind of small for the Great Basin, but so in that case, there's a buyout provision for the park for the cattle allotments on the east side of the park. There's no provision for the sheep allotments on the west side of the park. In 1999, there's this reverse negative sentence that says nothing in this legislation prevents the Park Service from accepting grazing permits. So grazing was grandfathered in, but in a very backhanded way, backwards way, there's a sentence that basically authorizes permit retirement. In Steens Mountain in 2000, I defy you to find it, but it's in there. If you know the land and you know the players and who got the money, and it was a big grand bargain to avoid a national monument that actually all the parties didn't want, there is a permit retirement in there. In the Owyhee country in 2009, the Omnibus Public Lands Management Act and the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, those are the modern buyout. Those are the language that is basically being used today in these subsequent bills for permit retirement. The Owyhee, the ranchers were afraid of a national monument. Senator Crapo liked grazing permit buyout. I dare say I gave him the idea, giving a talk at Redfish Lake, where the few sockeye are left in the Snake Basin, that he attended as a congressperson in 1996. And he really liked the idea. And I think you like it as you're a member of the Congress or the Senate, because you go, God, I got to take care of these ranchers, but they're going to vote for me anyway. They don't really add anything. They don't give me much money. I'd rather spend my political capital on a new post office or a new freeway in Boise or whatever, but I got to take care of these ranchers. So so he likes grazing buyout. A lot of politicians are the first to get the political elegance of it. Representative Simpson, Mike Simpson, a Republican on the Appropriations Committee, put in a provision that said if there's conflict between domestic sheep, any allotment with conflict between domestic and bighorn wild sheep because of pneumonia, a disease which is fatal to the wild sheep, there could be retirement. Poorly drafted language. They forgot to say it's not just in this fiscal year's appropriation bill, it's for everyone. They did it right in the same appropriation bill for the California desert. It doesn't have the 1 year limitation. It's the permit retirement in the California Desert Conservation Area is good forever. Driving that were wind power developers that were looking for mitigation for desert tortoises and things like that in their disturbance. In 2014, the Oregon congressional delegation again came through with a expansion of the monument and retired some Forest Service and BLM permits. The latest statutory one that I recall, I think I'm right on this, is Boulder White Clouds in central Idaho in 2015. Again, these were legislated acts of Congress. So if money was given to the permittee and the permittee gave the permit back to the Forest Service or the BLM, you could rest assured there would never be commercial grazing on that allotment again until Congress undid it. And the only thing harder than passing an act of Congress is undoing an act of Congress. So dealing with permittees, so there are some site-specific buyouts in the works. With permittees, every story is different, but every story is the same. They're getting old. They have kids that ran away from home 35 years ago. They're coming back to the ranch. They love it. They love their lifestyle. They love the buckle. They love the pickup truck and the lifestyle, the pointy pockets on their shirts and all of that kind of stuff. So they go through grieving. The ones when we got buyouts in Oregon Caves and the Cascade-Siskiyou and the others, we had a gun to their heads, politically speaking. They were on their way out. But it was going to be an unclear and a messy exit. And it wasn't a sure exit from our standpoint. So why not just give them a bunch of money they don't really deserve? We didn't try to be their friend. We said, we're here to give you money to leave peaceably. And they finally got it. So we now have a national bill in the House of Representatives that would authorize permit retire anywhere on the public lands. So the politics are a little different because the permittees and lessees that are willing to take the money and run are different than those whose business model who serve on the board of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and their affiliates. These guys plan to stay. And part of their business model for survival as a business is to buy up the ranches and the permits of their neighbors as they go broke. So they don't want their neighbors selling their grazing permits into the conservation market rather than the livestock grazing market. Now, if you're one of those permittees that want to go, you're not going to say that. You got to live in that town. And you're not going to say you take the money and run before you actually get the money and take it. So fewer than half that have taken the money are willing to hang around and expound on the joys of permit retirement. So, I don't know how many times I've heard a congressional staffer say, can you get a rancher to come out publicly and talk about this? Well, most of them will not because they hate our guts. They really don't want to go, but they will take the money. And even afterwards, they don't want to. Basically, it's somewhat of an admission that their lifestyle failed. So it can be tough on these folks. So as we look at this national bill, the leverage is different. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association posture on these site-specific retirements are they oppose them, but in principle, but they are neutral because those damn environmentalists have metaphorical guns to the head of permittees. You might lose your grazing because of a National Monument Proclamation language, or you're in trouble this way or whatever. ESA issues, Clean Water Act. So NCBA would look the other way on these because these guys were in a squeeze. But everybody would be available for this, and they hate that. They really hate that. So, but I think a grand bargain is possible, but it will be a grand bargain. What does the livestock industry want that we don't really care that much about? Maybe we don't care at all, really. But is there a trade here? Well, there might be. And I want to put this idea in your heads and make you go through the stress of having to, as they say about politics, it's like making sausage. You just want to eat it. You don't want to see it being made. So Barrasso has a bill that we've heard of, and it basically says, vacant lots, let's just open them up anytime there's an extreme event or disaster. Let's raid the Land and Water Conservation Fund money and capitalize the Range Betterment Fund so it doubles its output and the money's always there. And let's take a $5 million to pay private landowners to allow hunter and other recreations to cross private lands. Let's have 20-year permits, not the current 10-year term grazing permits and leases. And let's waive the NEPA one more time, 6 ways to Sundays. So, back to that for a second. Is there anything there that we could live with? Or a modification of it we could live with? Well, you could just raise the grazing fee and then capitalize the Range Betterment Fund, which is a terrible term because it is not making the range better, but that's what it is. I would urge us to consider accepting 20-year term grazing permits and leases rather than the 10. It's really important to the ranchers because that longer certainty, reliability, they believe strongly influences the permit value of these grazing permits they have and their ability to borrow money against public land grazing permits and leases from banks to fund their operations. So from my standpoint, I don't know of a lot of significant range reform meaning a reduction in numbers permanently is kind of the way I look at reform, that has happened through the permit renewal process. It just doesn't happen. So I think we should consider that. Voluntary requirement is ecologically essential. We know how cows suck 6 ways a Sunday. It's economically rational. When you got to talk about acres per cow rather than cows per acre, you're really in a lifestyle choice. It's fiscally prudent. The federal government lose a lot of money on the grazing program. It's socially just. Now, I say this somewhat hesitantly because, part of me goes, well, God, why the hell should we pay them for something they don't own? And they don't own a grazing permit. A grazing permit under law, and it's been decided in the Supreme Court at least 3 different ways since 1908. It's not a taking to remove a giving. In other words, because the federal government gave these grazing permits out, the federal government taking them back is not a taking under the Fifth Amendment that requires just compensation, much as the ranchers say it. But as a practical matter, these permits that they own or inherited have economic value. They can sell them to other ranchers for X dollars in AUM, permitted AUM. They can sell them for conservation in certain circumstances for perhaps 3 or 4 times that amount that would go for livestock grazing. And these guys, it gives them a golden saddle. They can retire early, they can get out of debt, they can retool their operations. All of these things have happened with ranchers that I know of that have had federal grazing permits bought out from them. And finally, it's politically pragmatic. God, the Marlboro myth, even though we don't smoke anymore, it's just the cowboy myth is so strong in this country, and we just don't do well. And earlier speaker hit me on the side of the head and says, it's the narrative. They have a better narrative than we do. And all we're saying is, no, your cows suck, they cause damage, and people just don't want to hear that. That's why Alan Savory's TED Talk is so great, because it was that fat-free hodgepodge Sunday. By going with emphasis on voluntary federal grazing permit retirement, it's politically pragmatic. We've done it before. We can do it again, and it will, I think, be the best course for the most significant reform of public land grazing. That's it.